Darrell eased his SUV into the farthest corner of the parking lot, away from the gleaming rows of luxury cars that basked under the relentless Scottsdale sun. The heat rippled off their polished surfaces, turning them into shimmering beacons of status and wealth. Prestige Motors, his newest acquisition, stood proudly before him, sleek, modern, a testament to high-end sophistication. But today, Darrell wasn't arriving as the owner. He wasn't here to command attention or bask in recognition. He stepped out of his car, adjusting the sleeves of his gray hoodie, the fabric soft and familiar against his skin. His jeans, well-worn and slightly faded, and his sneakers, scuffed from years of casual use, spoke of a man uninterested in appearances. He had chosen this attire with purpose. Today, he wasn't a man of wealth, just another face, another customer, another stranger walking into a world of opulence. As he approached the entrance, the dealership's glass doors reflected his image back at him, a stark contrast to the sleek, impeccable cars inside. Through the transparent panes he could see them, employees gathered near the front desk, their voices a soft hum of laughter and conversation. Carefree, comfortable, unaware. The moment he stepped inside, the air changed. The crisp chill of air conditioning washed over him, replacing the desert heat with the scent of leather and the unmistakable tang of fresh wax. Overhead lights bathed the showroom in a glow so precise that every car appeared almost ethereal, as if sculpted from liquid metal. It was a temple of luxury, and he owned it. Yet the moment they saw him, something shifted. The laughter dimmed, the easy chatter stilled. He felt their gazes flick over him, quick, assessing, dismissive. A man in a hoodie and worn-out jeans didn't belong in this world, not among the tailored suits and polished shoes of those who sold fantasies for a living. But Darrell wasn't here to be welcomed. He was here to watch, to listen, to understand. And then she appeared. Susan, a woman who had clearly spent years perfecting her presence. Her every step exuded authority, from the sharp click of her heels against the gleaming floor to the perfectly tailored cut of her blazer. Her hair was sleek, her makeup precise, and the clipboard tucked under her arm suggested she left nothing to chance. She approached him with a smile, polite, practiced. But beneath it, Darrell saw the truth. A flicker of doubt, a tightness at the corners of her lips, a silent question hovering in the air between them. "Excuse me." Her voice was smooth, professional, but laced with an undertone of reservation. "Can I help you with something?" Darrell met her gaze unruffled, his own expression an easy mask of calm. "Just here to look around," he said, his voice even, unreadable. The game had begun. Darrell gestured casually toward the cars, his expression unreadable, but his movements deliberate. Susan's eyes flickered, scanning him from head to toe, a glint of scrutiny replacing the polished warmth she had initially offered. Her carefully constructed mask slipped, revealing a fleeting shadow of something colder, something less inviting. "Are you shopping for a car?" she asked, her voice smooth but laced with skepticism, the kind that suggested she had already drawn her own conclusions. Darrell maintained his easy smile, his demeanor unshaken. "Something like that," he replied evenly. Susan's lips pressed together in a thin line. "Well," she began, her tone shifting into something more rigid, more guarded, "we cater to a very particular clientele. Most of our inventory requires pre-qualification." A pause. "Perhaps I could recommend—" Before she could finish, a voice interrupted from across the showroom. "Hey, Susan, the delivery guy is here." For a brief moment her attention wavered, but not for long. Her gaze snapped back to Darrell almost instinctively, as if making sure he wouldn't stray too far, wouldn't touch something he shouldn't. Darrell lifted an eyebrow, his tone light but his words pointed. "You're assuming I'm not qualified." The question caught her off guard, if only for a second, but she was quick, too quick to recover, her posture straightening, her expression smoothing back into something controlled. "I'm just trying to save you some time," she said, her smile stretched tight. "These vehicles start in the six-figure range. Maybe I can direct you to—" Darrell didn't flinch, but inside, he noted every syllable, every choice of words. the subtext beneath them. It was subtle, but it was there. A quiet judgment, a silent exclusion. The moment stretched, tension thickening in the space between them. His gaze drifted across the showroom, settling on a sleek silver coupe. The car's aggressive lines exuded power, precision. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out, his fingers grazing the door handle. "Nice car," he remarked, his tone neutral, but layered. Susan's brows knitted ever so slightly, but she forced a smile. "It is." A beat. Then, with cool detachment, "Perhaps when you're ready to make a serious inquiry we can schedule an appointment. For now, I'll have to ask you not to touch the vehicles." Darryl remained still for a moment, considering her words, letting them settle. Then, exhaling softly, he withdrew his hand, slipping it into his pocket. His movements were measured, calculated. He nodded once. "All right," he said smoothly. "Let's hear it. What would you recommend for someone like me?" Susan blinked, momentarily thrown by the directness of his question. She hesitated, searching for the right response. But before she could offer one, Darryl spoke again, his voice steady, unhurried. "If you think you know what I need," he said, eyes locked onto hers, "I'm all ears." For the first time, the carefully curated mask she wore cracked, just enough to reveal the frustration simmering beneath. She exhaled, the faintest flicker of impatience crossing her face before she caught herself, before she smoothed the edges again. "Maybe something more budget-friendly," she finally offered, her words clipped, her tone impersonal. "I can give you directions to a dealership that specializes in pre-owned vehicles." Darryl's lips curved into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it. Just understanding, just quiet acknowledgement. "That's quite the assumption," he murmured, the weight of his words settling between them like an unspoken challenge. For the briefest of moments, Susan faltered. Just a flicker. Then, just as quickly, she reset, shoulders squared, tone brisk. "I'll be back with a list of options," she said before pivoting sharply, striding away with purpose. Darryl watched her go, his expression giving away nothing, but he had seen enough. Darryl turned back to the silver coupe, his reflection staring back at him from its flawless, polished surface. The irony of it all wasn't lost on him. This was going to be an interesting day. He stood in the center of the showroom, hands buried in his pockets, his gaze sweeping over the pristine lineup of vehicles. He had always been careful not to make snap judgments, but Susan's condescending demeanor was hard to ignore. Around him, the staff had fallen back into their casual conversations, yet he could still feel the weight of their glances, fleeting, speculative. He recognized the look, the quiet scrutiny, the silent assumptions that had followed him for years. Susan returned moments later, gripping her clipboard like a lifeline. The tension in her posture, the tightness of her forced smile, it all betrayed a lingering irritation. "All right," she said, stopping just short of him, her tone clipped, professional but distant. "I've put together a few options that might be more suitable for your situation." Darryl arched a brow. "My situation?" "Yes," Susan replied, offering him a printed list. The paper trembled slightly between her fingers before he took it. He unfolded it, his eyes skimming over the selections: an older sedan, a well-used SUV, a compact hybrid. Affordable, practical, a stark contrast to the high-end models gleaming under the showroom lights. A flicker of amusement ghosted across his lips, but he quickly masked it, folding the list and slipping it into his pocket without a word. "I appreciate the effort," he said, his tone steady, unreadable. For a moment Susan hesitated. Perhaps she expected frustration, maybe even indignation. His measured response seemed to unsettle her, but she recovered swiftly, straightening her shoulders, resting her hands on her hips. "Look," she said, her voice dropping, adopting a conspiratorial edge, as if she were about to share an uncomfortable truth. "I'm just trying to be realistic with you. Prestige Motors isn't for everyone. I don't want to waste your time." Darryl met her gaze, steady and unyielding. And what exactly makes you think I'm not your target customer? Susan faltered, if only for a fraction of a second before composing herself. I've been doing this for a long time, she said, her voice firm. I can tell when someone's out of their depth. Out of their depth, Darrell echoed, rolling the words over his tongue as if savoring their weight. Interesting. A flicker of uncertainty flashed in Susan's eyes, but she pushed forward. I'm just being honest, she continued. It's better to be upfront than to have someone leave disappointed. Darrell exhaled a soft chuckle, shaking his head slightly. Honest, huh? He studied her for a moment before nodding, his expression thoughtful. I like honesty. He took a step closer, his voice calm but deliberate. How about this? You let me speak to the owner. Darrell tilted his head slightly, amusement flickering in his eyes. Think we can make that happen? Susan's eyebrows shot up, genuine surprise flashing across her face. For the first time, her polished composure wavered. The owner? She repeated as if she hadn't heard him correctly. That's right, Darrell replied, his tone light, almost casual. I'd like to have a word with them. Susan's lips curved into an awkward, forced smile. Well, that's not possible today. The owner doesn't just drop by for casual visits. They're a very busy person. I'm sure they are, Darrell said with a slow nod. But maybe you could give them a call. Let them know I'm here. I think they'd want to meet me. Susan's smile thinned, the strain of the conversation beginning to show. Her patience was wearing thin, and it was obvious. Look, sir, she said, her voice clipped. I'm trying to be as polite as possible, but this is getting ridiculous. I have other customers to attend to. If you're serious about buying a car, we can schedule a meeting with one of our sales consultants. Darrell held her gaze steady. Otherwise? He asked, his voice still composed but carrying an unmistakable edge now. Susan's expression hardened, her frustration bubbling to the surface. Otherwise, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. The words landed like a challenge, heavy and deliberate. Silence fell over the showroom. Even the employees who had been idly chatting a moment ago were now watching the exchange with quiet curiosity. Darrell didn't move. His eyes remained locked on hers, unwavering. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. All right, he said, scrolling through his contacts. I'll make the call myself. Susan's brow furrowed. What are you doing? Just calling the owner, Darrell replied, lifting the phone to his ear. Shouldn't take long. Confusion flickered across Susan's face, her previous confidence now laced with uncertainty. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came. All around them, a few employees had stopped what they were doing, their attention drawn to the unfolding scene. The energy in the room had shifted, anticipation thick in the air. Darrell held up a finger as if to say, just a moment, before turning slightly away and speaking into the phone. Yeah, it's me. I'm at the dealership. Everything's fine. Just a little misunderstanding. Could you let them know I'm here? He ended the call, slipping the phone back into his pocket. Then, turning back to Susan, he met her stunned expression with an easy smile. They'll be here shortly, he said simply. Susan's mouth parted slightly, her confidence visibly shaken. Who did you just call? Darrell didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let his gaze drift around the showroom, taking in the silent, watchful faces of the staff. They were no longer pretending not to notice. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on everyone present. A slow, almost playful smile curved Darrell's lips. I guess we'll find out, he murmured, his tone laced with quiet amusement. Susan shifted uneasily. Her polished exterior, so carefully maintained, was beginning to show cracks. The clipboard in her hands became a refuge, her fingers gripping it tighter with every passing second. The room felt frozen, as if time itself hesitated, waiting to see how the moment would unfold. Darrell, on the other hand, remained effortlessly composed. He leaned against a gleaming luxury SUV, his posture relaxed yet commanding. The whispers among the staff grew louder, darting glances exchanged in hushed curiosity. They all knew something was happening, something big, but they weren't sure what. Not yet. Then the heavy silence shattered. The front doors swung open, and a sharply dressed man strode in. His navy suit was impeccable, his polished shoes clicking against the pristine tile floor with an air of quiet authority. His expression was warm but serious, and the moment his eyes landed on Darrell, they lit up with recognition. "Mr. Carter," the man said, his voice carrying easily across the room. His lips pulled into an easy, respectful smile as he extended his hand. "So good to see you." Darrell met his handshake with a firm grip, a knowing glint in his eyes. "Thanks for coming, Alex. I appreciate it." A ripple of realization passed through the room. The atmosphere shifted, tensed. A few employees exchanged startled glances, while Susan visibly stiffened. Her grip faltered, and her clipboard nearly slipped from her grasp. Her gaze darted between Darrell and Alex, comprehension dawning with a slow, dreadful inevitability. Her mouth parted slightly, the color draining from her face. "Mr. Carter?" she echoed, her voice suddenly small. Alex turned to her, the warmth in his expression cooling into something more professional, almost curt. "Susan," he said, his tone measured, "I see you've already had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Carter." Susan blinked, her lips parting and closing as if scrambling for the right words. I didn't realize—" Alex cut her off smoothly, his voice firm. "You didn't realize he's the new owner of this dealership." A stunned silence settled over the showroom. Susan took an involuntary step back. Her clipboard now clutched against her chest, as though it could shield her from the weight of her mistake. Her features were locked in a mixture of shock and growing dread. Alex turned back to Darrell, an apologetic look crossing his face. "I trust this wasn't the kind of welcome you expected." Darrell lifted a hand, stopping him. "It's all right, Alex," he said, his voice calm but carrying a quiet authority that made everyone hold their breath. "I think Susan and I just got off on the wrong foot." His words were measured, but there was no mistaking the gravity behind them, the kind that made people listen. Susan swallowed hard, her throat constricting around the apology she desperately wanted to give. I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know—" Darrell held her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You didn't know what?" he asked, his voice gentle but unwavering. "That I could own a place like this? That someone like me might actually belong here?" Susan's eyes widened, her breath hitching. For a fleeting second she looked utterly lost, as though seeing the situation through an entirely new lens. "I didn't mean—" Darrell raised a hand, silencing her before she could finish. His voice softened, but the edge remained. "It's fine, Susan, really." He took a slow, deliberate step closer, and the entire showroom seemed to hold its breath. "But let me ask you something," he said, his voice dipping just low enough to draw everyone in. "If I weren't the owner, would you have treated me any differently? Would you have given me the same respect you'd offer someone who walked in here wearing a suit and tie?" Susan opened her mouth, but no words came. The weight of silence pressed against the room like an unspoken truth too heavy to ignore. Susan opened her mouth, but the words never came. Her silence was louder than any excuse she could have given. Darrell exhaled slowly, nodding, as if her lack of response confirmed everything he already knew. His gaze shifted to Alex, his voice steady, yet edged with authority. "Let's gather everyone in the conference room," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. "It's time we have a conversation about the way things are done around here." The employees shuffled into the conference room, their murmurs subdued by the weight of uncertainty. The room, a masterpiece of sleek design with glass walls and high-end furnishings, suddenly felt smaller, the air thick with unspoken tension. Susan sat towards the back, her usual composed confidence eroding into something uncertain. Darrell took his place at the head of the table, his stance commanding, yet controlled. He didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. His presence alone did that. Alex stood by the door, arms crossed, watching the room with an unreadable expression. The hum of whispers ceased as Darrell cleared his throat. His gaze swept over the room, not with anger, but with the weight of expectation. "Thank you all for taking the time to meet with me on such short notice," he began, his voice even but firm. "For those of you who don't know me yet, my name is Darryl Carter. As of last month, I became the new owner of Prestige Motors." A ripple of surprise coursed through the room. A few employees shifted in their seats. Others exchanged uncertain glances. Susan visibly tensed, her fingers clutching the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping her steady. Darryl let the moment settle before continuing. "I came in today dressed the way I did for a reason," he said, his tone measured, deliberate. "I wanted to see this dealership the way any potential customer would. I wanted to experience firsthand how someone might be treated when they walk through those doors without an expensive suit or a visible display of wealth." His eyes swept the room, pausing briefly on Susan before moving on. "What I experienced today was disappointing," he said, the words laced with something deeper than frustration, something personal. "I wasn't seen as a person. I was judged on assumptions, not on my worth, not on my potential. And I'm not standing here to single anyone out, but rather to ask, what does that say about the culture we've built here?" Susan shifted in her chair, her face pale. Darryl didn't press her just yet. Instead, he turned his attention to the room as a whole. "This isn't just about me," he continued. "It's about every person who steps foot in this dealership, every customer who doesn't fit into some predefined mold of what a luxury car buyer should look like. Because if I was treated this way, how many others have been? How many walked out of here not because they couldn't afford a car, but because they weren't given the respect to even consider one?" A younger salesman hesitantly raised his hand. Darryl gave him a nod. "Mr. Carter," the man started carefully, "I think most of us try to be fair to customers, but sometimes it's easy to make assumptions." Darryl nodded, acknowledging the honesty. "I understand," he said. "We all have biases, whether we want to admit them or not. But being fair isn't just about intentions. It's about action. We have to do better than just trying. We have to actively work against those biases. Because what we're selling here isn't just cars. It's an experience. And from now on, that experience will be built on something more than just prestige. It will be built on respect, inclusivity, and integrity." The room was silent, but something had shifted. Some faces showed understanding. Some remained uncertain. But they were listening. That was a start. His eyes found Susan again. She sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her confidence reduced to hesitation. "Susan," he said, his voice softer now, though no less firm, "I want to give you the opportunity to speak. Do you have anything you'd like to say?" All eyes turned to her. She hesitated, her throat bobbing as she swallowed hard. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, yet raw. I made a mistake," she admitted, her gaze dropping for a moment before she forced herself to look up. "I misjudged you, and for that, I am truly sorry." Darryl held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you for saying that," he said. "But this isn't just about an apology. This is about change, real change. And change starts with accountability." He turned his attention back to the rest of the room. "From today forward, we will be implementing new training programs, not just to improve sales tactics, but to ensure that every person who walks through these doors is treated with the same level of respect, whether they're wearing a $1,000 suit or a hoodie. Because at the end of the day, excellence isn't just about the cars we sell. It's about the people we serve." A murmur of agreement spread through the room. Even those who had been skeptical now seemed to understand. Susan exhaled, nodding slightly, as if finally accepting the weight of the moment. Darryl looked around one final time. The tension in the room now something different, something lighter. "This is just the beginning," he said. "But if we're going to call this dealership Prestige Motors, then it's time we redefine what prestige really means." And with that, the meeting was over. But the change? That was just beginning. The weight of Darrell's words settled over the room like a heavy storm cloud, pressing down on every person present. The air conditioning hummed softly in the background, a stark contrast to the thick silence that followed his statement. No one spoke. No one dared to move. The gravity of the moment hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. Darrell let the silence linger, stretching it just long enough to let the discomfort do its work. He wanted them to feel this moment, to sit in it, to understand the depth of what had just transpired. Then finally, he spoke again, his voice even, steady but firm. "Good," he said, his gaze sweeping across the room, meeting hesitant eyes and bowed heads. "I'm glad we all understand each other." He stepped away from the table, his hands resting on the polished surface, his posture neither aggressive nor relaxed, but commanding. "Let me be clear about something," he continued. "I didn't come here to shame anyone. That was never my goal. But I did need to see, with my own eyes, what kind of culture exists within these walls. What I saw today, it wasn't just disappointing, it was revealing. And now we have to decide what happens next." His eyes found Susan, who still sat near the back of the room. The once confident manager now looked small, her usual assertiveness buried beneath the weight of realization. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white, her gaze flitting between Darrell and the polished floor beneath her feet. "Susan," he said, his tone softer now, not to spare her, but to give her space to listen. "You've worked hard to get to where you are, I don't doubt that, but today was a wake-up call, not just for you, but for everyone in this room." Slowly she lifted her gaze, meeting his for the first time since the meeting had started. Her lips parted, but the words faltered before they could fully form. When she finally found her voice, it was quieter than before, stripped of authority but filled with something more important: genuine remorse. "I understand," she admitted, her voice carrying the weight of regret. "I was wrong, and I'll do whatever it takes to make it right." Darrell studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a slow nod. "I believe in second chances," he said simply, "but accountability comes first. You and I will sit down one-on-one and figure out what that looks like. In the meantime, we move forward, together." He straightened, his gaze shifting back to the rest of the staff. "We are not just selling cars here," he told them. "We are building trust. We are creating relationships. We are setting a standard of excellence, not just in what we offer, but in how we treat people. That matters more than any sale, more than any commission check. If you're on board with that, I'm here to support you every step of the way. If you're not, then this may not be the place for you." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, quiet at first but growing stronger. The tension that had gripped the employees since the meeting began slowly gave way to something else: understanding, maybe even a bit of resolve. Alex, who had been watching quietly from his position near the door, nodded in approval. Even those who had initially seemed skeptical now carried a different energy. Darrell allowed himself a small, measured smile, the kind that carried both relief and determination. "All right," he said, "let's get back to work, and let's make sure that from this moment forward we do better. Because how we treat people, that is what defines us." The employees began to gather their things, the sound of chairs scraping against the floor breaking the lingering stillness. As they filed out, Susan hesitated near the door, glancing in his direction before finally stepping forward. Her hands twisted together as she took a deep breath. "Mr. Carter," she said quietly, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to make this right. I won't let you down." Darrell studied her, his expression unreadable before giving a slow nod. "I hope you mean that," he said. "Actions speak louder than words. But if you're willing to do the work, I believe people can change." "I am," she said, her voice firm this time. "I mean it." He held her gaze for a moment longer before letting her go. As Susan disappeared into the hallway, Darrell turned to Alex. "Let's schedule a follow-up meeting with the staff next week," he said. "I want to make sure everyone understands what's expected moving forward." Alex grinned, his respect for Darrell evident in his expression. "You got it, boss." Darrell stepped out of the conference room and back onto the showroom floor, his eyes drifting over the gleaming cars, the polished metal reflecting the afternoon light. There was so much work ahead, more than most people could see. But for the first time since he walked through those doors that morning, he felt something unexpected: hope. This wasn't just about running a dealership. This was about creating something bigger, a space where people were measured by their integrity, their character, their worth as human beings. And Darrell Carter was ready to lead the way.